What is up, everybody? Welcome into the Two Stripes podcast, the college football podcast that most certainly does not get responses from school sports information directors about interviewing their head coaches. My name is Colton Denning, and I am your host. It is March 21st, 2017. I'm here on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon recording this podcast in lovely Boulder, Colorado. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank everybody that tuned in to the last podcast with State of the U talking Miami football with Cam Underwood. It was the most listened to podcast yet for the Two Stripes podcast. So big ups to Cam and big ups to everybody that listened to the show. I really appreciate it. If you want to continue listening or want to listen to past shows, you can do so by going on iTunes and searching the Two Stripes podcast. You can subscribe there. You can leave me feedback there. Please, if you subscribe or listen, I would greatly appreciate any sort of feedback, positive or negative, to help me make this show better and what you, the college football fan, want to hear from your college football podcast. So please, if you listen, go out to iTunes, search Two Stripes Podcast, and you can leave all of that feedback there. You can also leave me feedback on Twitter. You can find me at Dubsco, that's DUBSCO. And then you can also find the podcast on SoundCloud. If you go to soundcloud.com/twostripespod, you can find this episode and every single episode of the Two Stripes podcast right there. So let's get right into it. For this week's show, I was joined by the managing editor of Frogs O' War, Jamie Plunkett, to talk TCU football, to break down kind of what went wrong with the 2016 team, why the offense was so inconsistent, why the defense took a huge step back from what we've seen in previous years under Gary Patterson, and the outlook for the 2017 Horned Frogs. I usually have a bunch of filler and fluff in these intro segments before we get into the interview, but not this week. Y'all didn't come here to hear me babble. You came to listen to Jamie Plunkett talk about TCU football, so let's get right into it. All right, and joining me now on the Two Stripes podcast is the managing editor of FrogsOWar.com, Jamie Plunkett. Jamie, what's going on today, man? How you doing?
I'm pretty well, Colton. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Ready to get this podcast kicked off. Ready to talk some TCU football. I know that you're busy right now. TCU is in the NIT, just beat Iowa right now, so that must be, even though it's not tournament time and NCAA tournament, still an exciting time for the program.
Yeah, absolutely. Beating Iowa up in Iowa City on Sunday was huge, and now they face Richmond next in the quarterfinals down in Fort Worth, and there's a lot of hype around TCU basketball that hasn't been there recently. It's pretty cool.
Well, and one thing we saw a couple years ago, and something before we get into next year's team, the 2017 Horned Frogs, that I want to get into and get some of your thoughts on, is the rise of TCU football particularly in 2014. We saw a team with Trevon Boykin under center that was finished 7th overall in S&P Plus. They finished in the top 15 in both offense, defense, and in special teams as well. Just barely missed out on the college football playoff. And since then, even though they had a very good 2015, the last 2 years they've kind of taken a step back, maybe a lot more so in 2016 than in 2015. But what is the feeling around the program right now about kind of where TCU football stands, and what were the biggest reasons for last year's slide?
Good question. I think the outlook for TCU football is still pretty positive. I think fans are still upbeat the program. Like you said, the last 2 years have seen the program decline a little bit since that Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl against Ole Miss, 42-3 win. But I think part of that has to do with maybe a little bit of conflict on the coaching staff between Doug Meacham and Sonny Cumbie. Different thoughts on how to strategize, on how to game plan, on what the offense should be doing. That came to light in 2016 with just a really kind of inconsistent game plan presenting itself from Saturday to Saturday. When you see a real commitment to the run in a game like Baylor, where Kyle Hicks has 5 rushing touchdowns, almost 200 rushing yards. And then the next week, you see him get 8 touches. So there was a real inconsistency in the game plan in 2016, so that contributed a lot to the offensive efficiencies. Obviously, losing Trevon Boykin and Josh Doxson will hurt you. two guys that are NFL players now. You lost an offensive lineman to the NFL. Defensively, there were some injuries in the secondary that really contributed to some of the passing defense woes. Undersized linebackers contributed to some of the running defense woes. And so just overall, there was some struggles on both sides of the ball that really kind of manifested last year in a really inconsistent season. Kansas to be their offensive coordinator now, and with the promotion of Sonny Cumbie into that kind of play caller role, there's an opportunity in 2017 to see some more consistent play calling, some more consistent game planning, recommitment to the run that hasn't been there a few years. And so Frog fans, I think, are really excited about that prospect of giving the ball off to Kyle Hicks and Darius Anderson and Shewu Olonalau a little bit more. To really kind of ground and pound like the Frogs used to do with LT and a bunch of these old running backs back in the day.
And speaking of offense and some of the coaching shuffling that's gone on, Sonny Dykes, former Cal coach, was let go and hired as an offensive analyst. And in the last, I want to say 2 or 3 years, this has become a really big thing, especially when you look at a team like Alabama, who hires a bunch of these offensive analysts, Steve Sarkisian being one last year, and bigger schools like Ohio State doing it. This has become a big trend in college football, and maybe this isn't like a huge thing for TCU, but adding an offensive mind like him, he's been at the helm of some great offenses when he was Louisiana Tech's head coach, and then, of course, with Cal and getting Jared Goff to be the number 1 pick. How big, even if it's a short-term hire, how big is it just to have an offensive mind like that around the program? And do you think that Kenny Hill can benefit from that at all?
Oh, absolutely. When you bring in a guy like Sonny Dykes, who is familiar with the kind of system that Sonny Cumbie runs, it can only help your program to have another set of eyes on game plan, on, watching film of opponents coming up, and really kind of just being in the room to help figure out how this team is going to be successful from week to week. It's absolutely huge. Both come from the Mike Leach coaching tree, and so they both run this kind of wide open offense that still relies on running the ball in a significant way. And so I think that those two guys are going to work really well together. Like you said, it's probably a short-term thing. I can't imagine that Sonny Dykes doesn't want to get back into being a head coach here pretty quickly, but you take advantage of it while you can. Like you said, Alabama and Ohio State have kind of moved into this model of how they staff their program, and why wouldn't you want to imitate those two programs from a staffing perspective, right? So I think it's a great move for TCU to bring a guy like Sonny Dykes in, and I think that Kenny Hill can benefit. Obviously, Dykes has limited to no contact with players, especially in coaching and practicing situations, but Dykes being present and available to help game plan and help do some of that behind-the-scenes stuff still frees Sonny Cumbie up to be the quarterback coach that he can be. When Cumbie came in 2014, we saw this incredible transformation with Javon Boykin, and I think Frog fans have kind of been waiting for that same transformation to happen with Kenny Hill, and this allows Cumbie to still be free enough, I think, to be able to be more hands-on with Hill in that way.
One of the things, just looking at TCU on paper and not getting the chance to watch them every week, that kind of stood out to me looking at their stat profile was not only just Kenny Hill kind of being inconsistent, which you alluded to, but the offense as a whole, even with some of the playmakers. You look at Taj Williams, the leading receiver from last season. He averaged over 18 yards per catch, but 462 of those 702 yards receiving came in the first 3 games of the season. And then John D'Arcy, 13 of his 33 catches, 236 of his 412 yards came in the Iowa State and SMU games. Is that sort of inconsistency just a product of how Kenny Hill played last year, or is this an offensive-wide issue that they had in 2016? How big is that to fix going forward?
I think it was an offensive-wide inconsistency last season, just with the poor outcome of what the offensive line was doing. They were struggling to block in passing situations, in obvious passing downs. Receivers dropped a lot of passes. I think I saw a statistic from, I can't remember who it is, but the TCU receivers had the most drops in college football Division I last year. Or Hill had like the highest percentage of passes attempted dropped last season. So, when you're encountering things like that, obstacles like that as a quarterback, you look at Kenny Hill's performance and you say maybe some of that inconsistency really doesn't rest on his shoulders. Now, he did also throw a lot of balls low, a lot of off the mark. Accuracy was a big problem for him last year. So when you combine his inaccuracy in times with dropped passes, with a struggle of the offensive line to be able to block consistently on passing downs, That's kind of where the inconsistency of the entire offense derives from. And there was an unwillingness to run the ball at times with what I think to be one of the most dynamic running backs in college football, and Kyle Hicks. He's a great pass catcher out of the backfield, and he just didn't get used. I think like Frog fans wanted him to be used last year. So hopefully that's a fix coming in 2017, and hopefully we see these receivers holding on to passes a little bit better and Hill getting the ball out on time and where it needs to go. Those sound simplistic, and some of them can be, but frankly, it is just a matter of putting in the work. And Kenny Hill has been doing that. He met with George Whitfield over TCU spring break, the quarterback guru, who's worked with a lot of big names in the past. And so there's a commitment there from the team. Now it's just about putting up everything together.
And one of the guys that he may or may not get to utilize this season, KaVontae Turpin, was a kid who really broke out in his freshman year, was an explosive receiver, an explosive punt returner, only played in 8 games last year, and coming into spring practice, Gary Patterson has been kind of coy about his status with the program, mentioned academics and having to do a couple of other things off the field to get back with the team, and kind of said that they're basically going into the season with the fact that he won't be a part of the team, and if he is, it's a bonus. Do you have any update on the status of KaVontae Turpin, and how big of an addition would it be to get him back onto the team?
Well, it would be huge. Like you said, he's an incredibly dynamic slot receiver, power in the return game. We saw that in 2015 with 4 receiving touchdowns against Texas and close to 1,000 yards receiving on the season with 8 touchdowns, and just his ability to change momentum from a kickoff, it's incredible. So him being present in the fall is huge for the success of this team. Like you said, he missed 8 games he only played 8 games last year because he had a sprained PCL. And there was a noticeable difference in the offense when he was not on the field. So if he gets his stuff together, if he gets his academics in order, and he's with this team in the fall, he's going to be a huge contributor to this thing.
Flipping over to the defense, it seems like one of the big things from the outside looking in that people have always talked about with Gary Patterson and TCU has been the defense. And in the late 2000s and in the early 2010s, that really stood out in 2014 as well with the 15th ranked S&P Plus defense. And that's kind of fallen off. That fell off the cliff last year, finishing 59th. And now they lose a bunch of good players on the defensive line, including Josh Carraway, Aaron Curry, and James McFarland. What's the outlook for TCU's defensive line? And they still, despite some of the struggles, they were able to get after the passer pretty well. How are they going to be able to replicate that success, especially in a conference that passes so heavily like the Big 12?
Depth has always been something that Patterson has harped on, especially on the defensive line. And I think we're going to see that come into play this season. One of the things that Patterson has insisted on doing over the last couple of recruiting cycles is getting bigger in the trenches, and that's offensive and defensive line. So you see guys like Ross Blacklock, who redshirted last year, is from the 2016 recruiting class, who's a 330-pound defensive tackle who, by all accounts, is a monster in the weight room and is ready to just get on the field and dominate this year. You've got transfer kids that have come in over the past couple of years. You've got Matt Bozen, who is a transfer from California from a community college who really kind of came into his own last year at defensive end, who's expected to be a huge player this year. You've got kids like Brendan Bowen, who redshirted last year, who is ready to rock. You've got a transfer from Ben Benogu from Louisiana Monroe, who had to sit out last year, who's now going to come in and play defensive end. He was dominant at Louisiana Monroe in his freshman year. And then you've still got these other young kids like Isaiah Chambers at defensive end. You've got LJ Collier at defensive tackle, who's gained a ton of weight and is really looking good. Chris Bradley at defensive tackle, Joe Broadnax, who was a starter last year as a sophomore. So there is some depth there along the defensive line that I think can mitigate some of those losses. But you're right, especially Josh Carraway is a huge loss for this thing. Aaron Curry and James McFarland are losses as well, but I think the talent that was behind them on the depth chart will have an ability to kind of offset those losses this season.
Sticking with the passing defense, but moving into the secondary, TCU allowed a full yard per attempt more last year than they did in 2015. And like the Big 12 is the Big 12. You're going to give up passing yards. There's talented quarterbacks. There's talented receivers. That's fine. But with so much coming back in the secondary for TCU and a lot of talent there, how much improvement can we expect to see from their passing defense in 2017, especially if they're able to not maybe replicate the type of success they had with their pass rush last year, but if they're getting help from those guys up front, what can we expect from the secondary?
I think it's okay to expect big things this year. If you look at the beginning of last season, you had several guys that were hurt coming into the season. You had Ranthony Tejada, who had torn his ACL in the middle of the 2015 season, who very obviously didn't trust his knee when the season started last year. The back half of the season, he was a dominant lockdown corner. People didn't even throw his way for the last 4 or 5 games of the season. Same thing goes for Julius Lewis, who had a leg injury in the spring and wasn't expected to even play at all in 2016, came in for the last 3 or 4 games and played incredibly well, healed up faster than everybody expected him to. You've got depth at that corner position with guys like Jeff Gladney, who is a beast. You've got young kids coming in like this freshman Noah Daniels, who's expected to come in and compete to be in the 2 deep right away. And these guys are big bodies. They're all 5'10" to 6'1" to 6'2", and that makes so much of a difference when you have a healthy secondary to start the season, because it allows guys like safety Nick Orr to just play safety and not have to worry about the things that Nick Orr has had to worry about the last few seasons, where is he going to be at safety this play? Is he going to be a corner? He gets to focus on being a safety now. You've got healthy corners coming into the season. And so I think the expectation there then is that these guys are going to come out and perform right away, and we're going to see a pretty dramatic improvement in the passing defense.
Flipping back to the offense real quick, something that you mentioned that I thought was interesting, that dynamic between Sonny Cumbie and Doug Meacham, and now with, there's no more co-coordinator stuff. And you talked about Kyle Hicks, the running back, being a very underrated player. You look at his line last year, had 205 rushes for over 1,000 yards, over 5 yards per carry, and only fumbled once in his 205 carries. Now that TCU, at least on paper, is going to have more of a straight line identity, what can we expect to see from Kyle Hicks this season? How big of a year can he have?
Honestly, and this may sound homerish, and this may sound like I'm wearing some severely purple tinted glasses, but I think he has the potential to be a top 10 running back in college football if he gets the ball consistently and if he performs like we know he can. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into that, with this being a pass-first offense and with the potential for injury and all of this other kind of stuff. But if he gets the ball consistently and performs like he's capable of performing, I think that we could see him being this kind of next great running back in this line of fantastic running backs that TCU has seen. You've had, obviously, LT is kind of the main name, but you've also had Aaron Green and B. Catalon in recent years, and Hicks can just be the next guy in that line. It's all about getting the ball consistently, though. We know that he's a 3-down back. He's great in the running game. He's great catching passes, and he's phenomenal. He's a phenomenal blocker. It's just about making sure that he's getting the ball enough.
All right, so for an overall look at the program, not that TCU, if they have another season where they go 8-5 or even 6-7 again, not that they'd completely fall off the map, but how important is this season to the future of the program, especially given what OU is doing right now? They're recruiting at a high level. They've been to the college football playoff, and you look at Texas, who in past years has been that team in the Big 12, but for the last almost decade has kind of just been floating out at sea. But you can kind of expect under Tom Herman that they're going to eventually get back up to that place. How important is it for TCU to bounce back this season?
It's important. I mean, it's always important to minimize the amount of down years that you have, especially in a row. And obviously, like you said, there is an opportunity there, being a school in the Big 12 in the state of Texas, with UT being down, with everything that's been going on at Baylor that has really just kind of weighed that program down, with Cliff Kingsbury wearing out his welcome out at Texas Tech. There's a huge opportunity if TCU can string together some more 10-win seasons to really elevate the program even more. But, I think that, and I would be careful, this is kind of a tangent, I would be careful to expect so much from Tom Herman, because if you look at his resume going into that position and you compare it with what Charlie Strong's was, they're almost identical. And Texas fans, every fan base has these groups of people who will expect the world right away. But I think Texas fans should should be a little bit hesitant because they've been down this road before pretty recently. Not to say that he's not a great recruiter and not a great coach, but just maybe let things play out for a minute first before you expect national championships. And that's one of the things that TCU can really tout, though, not national championships, but the fact that they've had a head coach there for almost 2 decades now, who is, by all expectations, going to stick around. If you look at the jobs that Gary Patterson has turned down in the past, interviews that Patterson has turned down in the past, Florida, Ohio State, Arkansas, Kansas State, Notre Dame, USC, all of these jobs that he has declined even to interview. That gives young kids a good feeling that they know he's going to be there. And a couple kids from the 2017 class even said that. And some recruits are saying that now, we know Patterson's going to be around. And that's a pro in the TCU column for us. So, yeah, it's all about mitigating how many poor seasons you have in a row. I think this team, with as many talented kids as they return on both sides of the ball, with the coaching staff that's coming back, they have all of the pieces in place to be successful in 2017. It's just a matter of getting it done.
So looking at that 2017 schedule, at Arkansas, at Oklahoma State, at Oklahoma, but also get Baylor at home, West Virginia at home, and Texas at home. It's early. It's only March 21st, but what do you think is a reasonable expectation for TCU for the 2017 season?
That's a good question. Oklahoma State somehow always has had TCU's number. The Frogs are 1-4 against them since they've joined the Big 12. They're 2-3 against Kansas State, 1-4 against OU, and all 3 of those games are on the road this year. Looking at the schedule as it plays out, I would say that kind of a floor starting point for TCU fans would be 7-5, with the ceiling probably being, if they really kind of string it together and figure it out, ceiling being somewhere around 9-3, 10-2. I look at that Oklahoma game in Norman, and that's a really daunting task. Texas Tech and Lubbock, that's a weird things happen when you play in Lubbock. Frogs have experienced that before. Oklahoma State in Stillwater. It's a hard schedule. I mean, we can't twist that any other way. It's a tough schedule. But if the Frogs put things together, they could have a relatively successful season and be, in the top quarter of the Big 12 when it's all said and done.
All right, there you heard it. TCU always in the mix, always a very fun team to watch. Should be great to watch offensively and hopefully take a step forward on defense as well. Want to thank Jamie Plunkett for joining the podcast. If you want to check out any of his work or Frogs of War, you can do so at frogsowar.com. You can also check them out on Twitter at frogsowar, and you can find Jamie's work on Twitter at frogpreacher. You can also find him on Mavs Moneyball, the Dallas Mavericks site at SB Nation, and he contributes to another podcast as well, The People vs. the POTUS, a podcast about presidential history. So you're everywhere, man. You got it all going on
busy.
Between sports, between politics, which is especially a hot topic right now, and presidential history. I would highly encourage everybody to check that out. Jamie, thanks for joining the show, man. I appreciate it.
Appreciate the invitation, Colton.
Want to thank Jamie Plunkett of Frogs O War for joining the show. Definitely go and check them out. Check them out on Twitter at Frogs O War, and you can see all Jamie's work, like I said, at Frog Preacher. Definitely a show me type of year for TCU, especially with that schedule. At Oklahoma State, which Jamie alluded to, they've had problems with since joining the Big 12. At Oklahoma, who should once again be very good. And then you go at Arkansas in the second week of the season. And who knows what you're going to get from Arkansas, but definitely a very tough game and should be an interesting clash of styles with what TCU likes to do on offense compared to what Brett Bielema and the Hogs like to do with their offense. And even at Kansas State, that's a team that we've seen in the past have success and kind of fly under the radar. I wouldn't count that out as a game to watch as well. So, like I said, definitely seems like a show me type of year for TCU, but it's hard to imagine them going 6-7 again and 4-5 in the Big 12. But we'll see if their offense can fix some of their consistency issues, especially in the passing game. And with Jamie's assertion that Kyle Hicks may be a top 10 running back, if they're able to fix those issues, then that should open things up a lot for that running game and for Kyle Hicks. And we may end up seeing him as one of the better backs in the country before the end of the 2017-2018 season. And then looking at the defense, you would assume, just given Gary Patterson's mind and what he's done in the past, that they're going to be able to bounce back and at least put out a top 30 defense and not be in the 50 to 60 range like they were last season. So very interested to watch the TCU Horned Frogs this season and whether or not they bounce back from a pretty disappointing 2016 season. That'll do it for this episode of the Two Stripes podcast, but I got some good news. We are not done for the week. On Friday, I will be talking to Shakin' the Southland about Clemson football. We'll be discussing the defending national champions having to replace all of that talent, whether or not they can make another run at the college football playoff, whether they can win the ACC title again. All of that good stuff. Should be fun talking all things Clemson Tigers football with shakinthesouthland.com. So be on the lookout for that podcast dropping on Friday afternoon right here, the Two Stripes podcast. If you want to keep up with any of the podcasts, though, listen to any of the old ones, you can do so by subscribing, by searching the Two Stripes podcast on iTunes, like, review, rate, subscribe, all that good shit. Do that there. You can also find the podcast on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/twostripespod. You can listen in from there, and you can find any of my other work on Twitter at Dubsco. That's it for this show, though. I'll catch you on Friday. I'm Colton Denning, and this is the Two Stripes Podcast.